Hi everyone. So we are on week 9 and we're going to go through using your aids and some different figures. Some of these we've done in class already and some of it is going to be new information. So the first thing is talking about some horsemanship and thinking about taking our basic horsemanship to the next level. So we've gone about halfway through the semester. We've been riding quite a while now, and so we want to go from just barely communicating or giving just very direct communication to a higher understanding between you and your horse. So basics of horsemanship are staying on the horse, beginning to have control, and then being able to ride at the walk, trot, and lope or canter. And so far we are beginning to get control. We can ride at the walk and the trot, and hopefully in the next several weeks we will learn how to canter or lope. But having good horsemanship is refining those skills that you can be challenged by riding more higher level trained horses and ride with more control, comfort, and understanding. So some of you have been kind of struggling. It does take time for us to build up to have some higher horsemanship skills. So we've been talking a lot about aids recently, and I do think this is important that we keep going on about the aids. So if you'll remember, your natural aids are your weight or your seat, your legs, hands, and voice. So there are 4 natural aids. Hopefully you remember those, but definitely something you need to know. But then there are times when we need more than just our natural aids to get our horses to respond or to go to that higher level. And so we then can use artificial aids. And artificial aids are basically aids that you are going to use to reinforce your natural aids. So for instance, spurs, or a crop or a bat or a whip, some of those kind of things would be artificial aids because they are aids that you're going to use to reinforce your natural aids. For instance, a spur goes on your boot that pokes into the side of your horse, but you should be using your calf and your leg muscle before you ask with a spur because it should be used to reinforce when they don't listen to your leg. So really an artificial aid a lot of times is going to be used for correcting if they are doing incorrect behavior. But one thing about that is you need to use it within 3 seconds of whatever they did so that for your horse they understand why you're using that aid and what it's for. Horses don't have the ability to reason. So if you smack them with a whip 10 minutes after something they did, they're not going to relate that to what they did 10 minutes ago. Instead, they're going to relate it to whatever they were doing just immediately before you hit them with the whip. So understanding that can go a long ways. Another thing about it is you want to use self-control and not a temper. Sometimes we get angry, horses do things we don't want, or they're just not listening to you and it's frustrating, but you don't want to go to something extreme and get really angry with your horse because that's just going to lead to more problems. So less is more. 1 or 2 taps with a crop, a light squeeze with your spur is going to be plenty. And then if you need additional, there is that opportunity. So remember the ask, tell, command. And then you should never use a bat or any type of artificial aid on your horse's head. So some types of artificial aids, spurs used to reinforce the leg, usually can be more precise, but you should be an advanced rider, have extreme control of your legs. So if you are not to that level, you should not be using spurs. If you can't make your horse go with just squeezing your legs consistently, then you should not be using a spur because it's just to reinforce more precision in when you ask for things, not just if you're out of shape or your horse is a little lazy to make them go. A crop or a bat is usually it's between 18 and 24 inches long, and it's usually a stiff tool with a flat like popper type thing on the end. And so you can see in the picture here that we have this right here would be a Western popper bat, and then also here's a crop that's used a lot more often in English, but it has this little popper on the end. So one thing about a crop or a bat is they actually are not that painful when you use them. It's more that they make a noise when you hit them with it. And that noise is what's going to make your horse go, oh, I should be listening. I should be paying attention. But one thing about it is you do always want to hit behind your leg or on their rump or their hind end, not up on their shoulder or their neck. And so that means that when you're holding the reins, you have to let go of your reins with the hand holding the crop to use it correctly, because it's not long enough. And so you would put your reins in your other hand and hit with your crop or your bat. And so it can take some skill to be able to do that. So if you can't ride around comfortably and pretty easily with just one hand off the reins at a time and be able to make them go and steer and everything, then you probably don't need to be using a bat. Next is a training or a dressage whip. So that's this long whip here. They're usually really thin, and they're about 36 to 39 inches long, and they're usually used for training and dressage. And with them, you don't have to take your hands off the reins because they're really long, and you can use it back behind your leg on their side, which is where you would ideally want to use it to teach them different things. But it definitely needs to be for advanced riders. It could potentially hurt your horse. So next is putting your aids to work. So we really want to think about, we kind of talked about this a little bit in lab this last week about using more than one aid, and I do think that's important, that you should be putting your aids to work. So you need to make sure you know what you're communicating to your horse. And so knowing how to use all of your natural aids properly and some of them together at the same time will help you give more information to your horse. So use of your aids can get better with time, and riding the horse will seem to get easier with more practice. So some different rein aids. So using your hands, you have some different aids and some ways of asking your horse to turn. And so some of you that are having trouble with your horses getting them to turn, some of these things might help you. And so things to think about. So there's like 4 different type of rein aids we're going to talk about. So the first one is your leading rein. And this is going to be where you bring your hand out to the side and lead your horse around in a turn. So you can see here in this first diagram that this is a left leading rein. So her hand, instead of coming back towards her hip, is out to the side of her horse's neck to ask them to turn. This can be used to turn a horse without slowing them down, but it works best on wide, gentle turns. So if you are doing this with your horse and wanting them to turn on a small turn or turn sharply, it's probably not going to give them enough information. So your left hand, in this case, because they're turning left, goes out to the side, but then you must move your right hand slightly forward so that you give them room to bend their neck. So you can see here, the left hand comes out, the right hand is going to go slightly forward as they turn around this corner with a leading rein. The next one is a direct rein, which is where you pull directly back with the direction rein on the side you're planning on turning. So if we're turning left, a left direct rein, you're going to pull directly back towards your hip with your left hand. And this will work against the horse's forward motion, but it gives more control on a tight turn. So those of you that are having trouble getting your horse, they want to stop when you're turning, this is part of a direct rein can sometimes cause that because it is going to work against their forward motion. So that's why if you do a direct turn, a direct rein, then you also need to be squeezing your legs during this turn to get them to understand that it's not meaning to stop, that you're squeezing them to tell them to keep going forward as you're pulling directly back to your hip. If you pull both reins directly back, then you're asking them to slow or stop. So direct rein can be used with both hands, but then it's telling them to slow down or stop. An indirect rein, which is this picture right here, This works by putting sideways pressure on one side of the horse's mouth. So in this case, you're going to take, if we're doing left indirect rein, so you're turning left, you're going to pull towards like your belly button rather than your hip, or at least that's how I kind of like to think about it. So you're going to pull left rein kind of towards your belly button. But you also have to use leg aid with an indirect rein. So in this case, you're wanting your horse to turn left, you're going to have to use left hand pulling towards your belly button or your opposite hip and squeezing with your right leg to help them go around this corner. Because otherwise, if you're pulling towards the middle, your horse is going to bend their head around and not move. So a lot of you that are having issues with your horse wanting to stop, you're probably doing an indirect rein and not realizing it. So a direct rein pulls straight back to your hip, and you have to keep leg to keep them going forward. But with an indirect rein, if you're pulling across or towards the middle of them, instead of pulling straight back towards your hip, where some of you I know when you pull, you want to pull over to the side. So instead of pulling directly back this way, you're pulling towards the middle. If you're doing that, then your horse is, and you're not using outside leg with that, or right leg for turning left, then what your horse is going to do is they're just going to bend their head around towards their shoulder and potentially stop moving, or actually evade all of that and go the opposite direction of where you want them to. So if you're using an indirect rein, you want to make sure that you are pulling left hand towards your middle or your belly button, and you're using right leg kind of bumping or squeezing to keep them going forward. Some things along with this is you want to make sure you don't cross over the neck. So if you're pulling so hard with your left hand that it crosses the middle of their neck, then that is not correct, because that actually will cause more problems, because then a horse kind of has to go in a box, and they have to have room to move their head and go forward, go to the right or go to the left. And if you pull all the way across, you close a lot of the places for them to be able to move. And so you want to make sure that you don't do that. And then the last rein aid I'm going to talk about is a pulley rein, and this is mainly used for an emergency stop. So if your horse takes off running, or they're bucking, or something they shouldn't be doing, then potentially a pulley rein is important. Otherwise, it's not really a rein you're going to use ever just riding around, but it's good to know how to do it. And so basically what you're going to do is you're going to lift, so you're going to lift up with your hand and lift up and pull with whichever hand, so your right or your left. And so a horse, a lot of times when they buck or crow hop or do anything bad, they put their head down. And so this, if you lift up and pull, it lifts their head up so they have to put their butt down on the ground. But then also, if it pulls them into a small circle, they also can't keep going forward. And so that is why a pulley rein is important. But that would also be something to think about if, when you're asking your horse to turn or stop or any of those things, you lift your hand way up to ask them to do it, that's potentially another reason they could be stopping. So these are all things just to be thinking about as you're riding around and asking them to turn and do circles and those kind of things. So next we're going to talk about our leg aids, because beyond just squeezing, there are more things you can do with your legs. One thing to note is leg aids are the same regardless of discipline that you're riding. So if you're riding English or Western, your leg aids are the same, and they don't change. On the Western side with our rein aids, they will change if you're riding one-handed versus two, but since we ride two-handed in the class, those rein aids are the same for English and Western. So leg aids. Some different things to think about. Both legs in a normal position is going to be like hanging down near the girth. So that's your normal leg position. And you squeeze with your legs right at your horse's girth or cinch. So squeezing at the cinch or the girth tells your horse to wake up, move, to go forward, to go faster, those kind of things. And then another thing you can do, same, keeping your leg aids in that same position, so right down at the girth. If you just squeeze potentially your inside leg that's going to tell your horse to bend. And so ideally when we turn a corner, we don't want a horse to turn with their body square or to drop their shoulder and fall in as they turn. And so if you squeeze the inside of their body with the motion of their movement, it can help get them to bend their body around rather than just fall over. Another leg aid that you can use is moving your legs slightly behind the center of the girth. So using your leg 3 to 4 inches behind the center girth, that is going to tell your horse to move their hind legs sideways away from that pressure. So, and this is going to be used a lot for steering to direct their rear end during turning. So we talked about on the previous slide about using an indirect rein. So you're pulling kind of across towards your belly button, but then you would also want to move your leg back slightly behind the center girth to squeeze to get them to follow around. So with your outside leg to push them around. So here's some pictures of what I'm talking about. Another thing to think about is your leg aid. It should be used with the inside and big muscle of your calf. So you aren't necessarily using your heel and your foot for communicating with your horse. It is your lower leg and your calf muscle is what you should be squeezing with. However, if you ask with your calf and you're squeezing with your leg, your whole lower leg, and they aren't responding, then you can dig your heel of your foot into their side to get a better response sometimes. So that is something to think about if you're having trouble getting them to really listen. So thinking about the ask, tell commands, you can also ask with your calf muscle. If they're not responding, kick your leg, so squeeze the whole leg against their side. And if that's still not working, using just your heel and kind of pushing your heel into their side can also take that aid to another level. So both legs together at the girth, left leg at the girth. You can see it gets this horse to bend his body around the curve. And then here we have left leg behind the girth to get them to move their hip or their hind end one way or the other. So then using our seat aids. Again, your seat aids are the same for English and Western riding. And they're used to strengthen or help the horse's movement from the hindquarters or rear. And it's essential for collections, stops, and all advanced exercises. So that is one thing we're not really talking about a whole lot right now because it's really more important when we get to further, more advanced maneuvers. And so you can see here, they're pushing their seat down, sitting up tall, pushing their seat down, so pushing kind of on your pockets or your butt can help push your horse's hind end forward. So when we get to asking our horses to do some more advanced maneuvers, we'll talk a whole lot more about using our seat aids. So when the rider pushes the seat bones down and forward into the saddle, the weight changes to tell the horse to wake up or to move forward, to shift their weight back to their rear, or to prepare to slow down and stop. Now, if you push down and forward with your seat bones, it can help cause the horse to turn. And so some different things you can use. Next, we're going to watch a little video about this so you can get an idea of exactly what I'm meaning or what we're talking about.
Discipline similar to that, where you need a little bit more fine-tuned communication with your horse, this is the way you want to be riding. So we did a little video actually right before this one on equitation, and that is key. So first you want to have that equitation down. Mainly you want to be sitting on your sit bones versus up here on your pelvic bones. You want to be sitting back here on your seat, nice and grounded in the saddle, flat back, That's really the first key to being able to ride with your seat, because from there you can relax, you can open up through your hips, which is the key to getting a better ride from your horse. Okay, so from here, I'm going to ask her to move forward, and I'm going to do it with my seat. So basically, I just kind of came forward a little bit, my hands came up a little bit, and I just thought forward motion. And from there, I really didn't even have to tighten my legs. Now, if she wouldn't have responded, if she would have been kind of asleep, I would have used my legs. I would have followed up with a little squeeze, and if I needed to, even a little bump, bump, bump with my calves. But she's pretty tuned into this. And now as we're going forward, I'm going to just ask her to walk on a little bit. And again, I'm not going to use my legs to do it. Instead, I'm just relaxing a little bit more through my seat, through my hips, getting a little bit more motion in the saddle, and that allows her to walk on a little. Now there, I'm just going to follow up a little bit with my leg. And you can see she just has a nice forward walk. Now next, I'm going to ask her to stop by stopping all this motion. So I used no rein contact. All I did was think about stretching up a little bit, letting my legs stretch down, and just tightening my hips. So I went from moving to kind of swaying as she was walking along to just tightening enough to stop that motion. And horses do not want to go against your movement, especially as you get more relaxed and you can move with them. They're going to stay in tune with what you're doing. They're not going to go against that. So that's how I can get her to go forward and how I can get her to stop so easily just with my seat, not by using the reins. So we're going to go forward again. Ask her for a little more walk. This time we're going to take it up into the trot. And to do that, again, not going to use a lot of leg. I'm just going to kind of lift the front of my hips and think trot. Back to the walk, back to the trot. And you can see how she has a lot of lift. She's really responsive to that, but I'm not using a lot of strong aids to get there. We're going to cover one more thing with this seat video, and that is steering. So instead of just pulling to steer one way or the other, you can steer with your seat. You're going to look where you want to go, and you're going to just let your hips move and push the horse around the turns. Now I'm steering this way. And if I need to use my rein as a supporting aid, which I did there, I open the rein instead of pulling back. Pulling back is going to shut down all your forward motion. So I'm using my seat to steer. I'm kind of pointing my hips where I want to go, using the rein only as a supporting aid. So I'm just kind of, keeping it on this small circle here today, but we'll do some other videos where we're working on a little more advanced things, working, using the whole arena and doing a little bit more. And when you use your seat to do those turns, especially when you're trotting, cantering, you're really going to have a much more smoother, kind of more flowing ride, instead of if every time you get to a turn, you're just pulling that horse around the turn. So really, riding with your seat is all about kind of, essentially being one with your horse, just in the fact that they're following your movement in the saddle, whether it's going faster or slower, or whether it's going through the turns. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Like it on Facebook, share it on YouTube.
So hopefully that was a good video to kind of just visualize what it means to use your seat aids, because sometimes that one's a hard one to see because you can't necessarily see what we're talking about, but hopefully that helped. Okay, so next we're going to talk about voice aids. Using words such as walk, trot, or whoa. I would say most of our horses do understand some words. I would say they don't understand everything, but they have to be trained to do so. So for instance, most of our horses, actually I would say all of them, they understand that if you cluck at them, that does mean they need to be going forward or faster than what they're doing currently. Or, for instance, if we say easy, that means to slow down, or calm, to get slower. So thinking about those, it is important that we use those. I know some of you, your horse keeps stopping when you're trying to turn, but I don't hear you clucking. So if you are really pulling and it's hard for you right now to do everything at once, for instance, pulling and kicking, and if that's hard for you, at least use your voice, because your voice can help signal to your horse that they should be moving and keep them going forward. So if you're struggling with the turning or to keeping them going, at least cluck, especially on those lazy horses that they aren't going to do more than you make them. If you're struggling to do all of these things at once, I recommend at least cluck at them if they won't go. However, one thing to think about is you don't want to be clucking constantly. So your horse slows down, you ask them to turn and they stop and they won't go, cluck at them. Once they start moving in, stop clucking. Or when we go to stop, you need to be saying whoa every time you ask your horse to stop. However, if you're just asking them to slow down, you should not be using the word whoa. So there's several different ways of using our reins and things to think about. So loose rein riding, this is going to be done most commonly in Western and used in a lot of our Western events. And so in this case, your reins are not tight, like they're going to have a nice loop in them. As you can see here in this picture, there's a nice loop here in the reins. And those of you that are riding in a curb bit, because your horse, the reason you're riding in a curb bit is probably because your horse will listen better for turning and some of those kind of things, and not necessarily to keep them going slower, except for maybe a couple. And in those cases, really you should be riding on kind of a loose rein, as they'll probably listen to you a whole lot better. It gives them freedom to move their head and neck, and it doesn't put any pressure on the reins unless you're asking them to do something. And then also when we're cooling out at the end of the day, end of lab, and we're just walking, you should let them be on a looser rein. Still have hold of your reins where you have control if you need to, but a nice loose rein to let them relax their head and walk around comfortably. Next is light reins, and this is kind of more what I would expect most of us in class to be using. And so they're not real loose that you have no control, but they're not so tight that your horse feels restricted. So there should be just a little slack in the reins. So it asks them to pay more attention to you, but it gives you a little more control, and it still gives them quite a bit of freedom. And you do still want a light seat aid when you're riding with light reins so that you are communicating with them. Next is riding on contact. I would say this is going to be most commonly for hunt seat riders. Western, we don't ride on contact very often. I would say potentially in your horsemanship classes during a pattern you might ride on contact, but otherwise in Western we usually ride on a loose rein where when you pull you have contact, but when you're just going around regularly and your horse is behaving and listening, then they have freedom. So if you're riding on contact, there will be no slack in the reins. When you ask your horse to do something, it's going to be minimal. It'll be hard to see from, if you're skilled at this, people won't be able to see you doing much because it's just your hands doing the slightest little thing to ask them to do something rather than going from a real loose rein to like pulling. But you don't want to ride on contact until you're pretty good with your seat, you're pretty comfortable in the saddle, you have an easy way of keeping them going. So when you ride on contact, you have to use your seat to help communicate, because if you're not using your seat, your horse is going to be confused. So a steady, balanced seat drives your horse forward, contact with the legs to help keep them going, because if you have contact, they can feel your hands and they may think that you're asking them to slow down. And then using your hands to direct them and tell them what you want them to do. So some things that I think for all of us we need to be thinking about, and things that are going to help you have a better seat. And the more comfortable you feel on your horse, then the easier things are going to get for you throughout the semester and riding in general. So one thing is using your joints, your ankles, knees, and hips as shock absorbers. These joints should be kind of moving with the horse's bouncy gait. And this will help relax you and keep you from being stiff, because ideally you want to be where you kind of move with your horse and your legs move with your horse, because if you're stiff and tense, then you're actually going to be causing yourself to be more bouncy. So if you feel like right now it's really bouncy when you're riding, part of that is probably just that you're not riding relaxed enough and that you are not using those joints to absorb shock. So some things that we need to be thinking about and avoiding when you're riding in your position that are going to help you become a better rider, and it's going to make everything throughout the semester a lot easier, are these few things. So stiff, tense back with tight muscles. So you don't want to ride with really tight muscles, pinching your knees or stiff hands. That's going to make you really bouncy if you do that. You don't want to have an overarched back with your heels up, because this is going to make you probably not feel very sturdy. So if you ride like this, you're probably going to, occasionally you probably feel like you're going to fall over one way or the other and you lose your balance, because it's really hard to keep a really good balance when your back is rounded and your heels are up. Another one would be tipping forward, having a lot of arch in your back, your stirrups being too long and tipping forward. This also is going to lead to lack of balance and probably not going to feel that comfortable. And also it's going to be really stiff for you to ride this way on your horse. And then leaning too far back with your legs head and you have a stiff brace leg. So this, you're going to be behind the motion of your horse. You're going to cause bouncing and soreness. So if you're feeling like you're really bouncy and sore, kind of evaluate your position and think about, are you riding in one of these different types? So are you really stiff and tense and not relaxed as you're going around? Because if so, that's probably an indication that's causing you to be stiff. So you want to ride relaxed, have your joints be fluid where they're absorbing shock. If you have too much arch to your back, you're probably not going to feel very balanced. You may feel off, like you might fall off occasionally. Tipping forward and pinching your knee, those are going to throw you off on your balance. And then if you're leaning back too far, it's going to cause you to be stiff as well. So here's another quick video for you to look at to get an idea of
the next riding tip we're going to go
at.
over is seat position. And seat position is a common problem with most riders. A lot of people become confused about where they actually need to sit. And a lot of different disciplines require just a slight difference in the change of the upper body or the incline of the upper body. And what we're going to go over today is your basic home seat, is what I call it. I always have a home position for everything so the rider knows what to come back to. And you'll see that Bethany is actually wearing a flashlight. And I'm a big prop user. I love to use props to help my riders understand exactly what I'm looking for. So what we're going to start with is a lot of people don't really know where their seat bones are. So you do have a right seat bone and a left seat bone. So Bethany, I'm going to ask you to take your feet out of the stirrups for me. And you want to make sure that your horse is standing still when you do this, and do have the help of a helper to hold on to your horse if you need to. Okay, so go ahead and bring your both legs over the pommel and keep your knees bent. Good. And then I want you to just slide forward and scoot your butt forward in the saddle. Exactly. And you can see that this flashlight is going to point straight down through the horse's belly. And that's what we're looking for. So you can feel now that you're on your seat bone. Jess?
Yes.
Okay. So go ahead and put your feet back in the stirrups. Good. And what we're going to find is that now the position of her body is more upright. Okay. Even in English riding, you want to make sure that you can use this seat because this is your neutral position. Right? We're going to talk about the 3 positions of the seat. And we're going to use this flashlight because this is a good view of what it actually looks like with your pelvis. So Bethany, go ahead and tilt your pelvis forward for me slightly. And you can see now that the flashlight, which will resemble her seat bones, is starting to point back towards the horse's back legs. And that's what we don't want. Because this way, when you're sitting this way, your lower leg will slide back slightly. And now your upper body is inclined too far forward, which is going to make you pull on the horse's reins too much. Okay, go ahead and show us the other, which is too far back. And now you can see that the flashlight is going to be starting to point towards the horse's front legs. And we don't want that either, because this actually becomes like a chair seat, and it can also be a driving seat for a horse. So go ahead and position your body so that your flashlight is pointing straight down through Mancha's belly. And you want to pretend like this flashlight is as big and as bright as possible. So it's going to point straight down through his belly as much as possible while she's riding. All right, so the next thing that I want to go over is I have this smiley face bucket here, and I want to talk about the pelvis, because a lot of people don't really exactly know where the pelvis is located. If the inside of her body were this bucket, right exactly where her seat is, and it was filled to the top with water, if you were to tilt your body forward, show us what would happen with the water bucket. Okay, so you could see that the water would start pouring out the front. We don't want that. Okay, so go ahead and keep the bucket neutral. Good. And then show us what it would look like if you started to lean back too much with your seat. So now the water would start to come out of the back of the bucket. So we want to make sure that the bucket stays level and even. And that's just a good visual and a good imagery essential for you to use as you're riding. I'll take that bucket. Okay. And one more thing, as she's sitting, she wants to make sure that her seat bone is in fact over the top of her heel. So we're going to actually move her lower leg back just slightly. There you go. And now her lower leg is actually hanging in neutral position, which gives her the most effective leg cue. Okay, we can also see, we'll fix your flashlight, that the flashlight would be pointing straight down towards her heel, which is exactly where we want it to be. It's almost as if the rider is sitting on their heel. So that's just some tips for you to help you find your seat bones and help you have a much more effective, influential seat.
So hopefully that video gives you a good idea of what I'm talking about where you should sit in the saddle. Because some of you occasionally I'm like, oh, you need to sit back more on your butt, or some of you need to lean more forward. So while you're riding around, this is something you should definitely be thinking about every day when we're in lab. Am I in the correct spot? Is my seat centered? Am I sitting up tall? Is it my home seat in the correct spot? So one thing is backing. So we are going to learn how to back our horses next week in lab. And one thing you need to think about with a back is a forward movement. Yes, your horse is going backwards, but it's a forward, so they're going. It's not a stopped movement. And so you don't want to just pull back on the reins. You also need to use your legs to tell them to be moving forward, even though really they're moving backward. So to ask them back, you pull with both hands. You're going to squeeze your legs. You want to put pressure on the back of your seat, so you're going to kind of tilt your seat slightly back and pull back on the reins to ask them to back up. And you want to still sit tall and relaxed, and your upper body should be tall. It's just a matter of at your hips or your seat slightly turning, going back. So improving your seat at the trot. Learning to sit the trot is going to require lots of practice at the walk, and also can get you more comfortable. So when you are relaxed in the saddle, your hips at the trot should kind of lift and drop as you're going. And so you want to keep a nice relaxed seat, and then go with the movement of your horse and try not to force it, try not to brace against it. The next important thing is understanding what a transition is. A transition is any type of change in a gait. So there are three main types of transitions. So the first one is going from one gait to another. So let's say we're walking and we trot, or we trot and we lope, or we walk to a lope, or we're trotting and we walk, or we lope to a walk. Those are all a transition from one gait to another. The second type of transition is going to be changes of a speed within a gait. So we may do a slow trot to a more extended or faster trot. That would be a transition within a gait. Or when walking, we walk real slow to a speedier walk. Those are transitions within a gait. And then the third and final type of transition is going to be from any gait to a stop, or a stop to any gait. So your horse is not moving to a walk, or not, so they're stopped, and they trot and they stop to a canter, or they canter to a stop. lope to a stop, that is your third type of transition. So any gait to a stop. But it is important when you're doing those transitions. So you're going from one gait to another, or from a gait to a stop, or you're speeding up or slowing down within a gait, that it's smooth and not really all that noticeable. And so you have to let your balance shift when with your horse's movement. So you have to be with him. So you kind of have to think about it. We're moving, I want us to slow down. Rather than we're moving and then I'm bouncing and then I'm pulling. It should be all kind of together with the motion of your horse. And then, so improving your seat when you are cantering or loping, which eventually we are going to lope in this class. And so we need to kind of understand it and keep moving towards that. And at the lope or canter, it's kind of a rolling gait. And so you want to make sure you're moving your hips with the movement of the lope and not bouncing against it. So you need to sit up straight and tall, but you still need to be relaxed. And then you need to let your hips follow the motion of your horse. And you don't want to stiffen or push against the saddle, because that's actually going to cause you to bounce when you're loping, which would not be a good thing. So the next thing, once we do start loping, is we want to make sure that our horse is loping on the correct lead. And so we talked about with footfall patterns, there's a left lead and a right lead. But then we didn't really talk about, if you're riding, how you would identify if they're on the correct lead. And so there are two ways to identify the correct lead. And the first one would be sight, and the second would be by feel. And I would say in the beginning, when you first start loping, you're going to identify if they're on the correct lead by looking. And then later, once you've ridden a lot longer, it gets easier to just feel it. So feeling it, you should feel that their inside front leg is leading or lifting up higher, and it should feel balanced and smooth. So if you're doing the left lead, or your left fore and right hind, this slide is messed up, are your leading legs. So here's what it looks like if you're on the wrong lead. And I will say that it is really uncomfortable when you're sitting on your horse around a corner on the wrong lead. And so we will probably talk about that a lot. But in the beginning, if you don't really know what a lope feels like to begin with, it's hard to identify from feel whether or not your horse is on the correct lead. But some things that horses potentially do wrong when we're loping, they can be stiff or one-sided. And this can be, for instance, if you only use your horse, you never ever take them to the right, and you always just go to the left, then they're going to be smooth and comfortable loping on the left lead and not so much on the right lead. A lot of times our rope horses, they mainly just lope on the left lead, because when you go to rope, your horse is going to turn left. And so a lot of rope horses, we say they don't have a right lead. Well, technically all horses have both leads. They just may be stiffer on one side when you're on them. The next lead problem, besides just being out of lead or one-sided, is they could potentially cross canter. And that means that they have one lead with the front end and a different lead with their hind end. So they may be on the left lead with their front legs and then on a right lead with their hind legs. And you would think, how do they do that? But they are very capable of cross cantering, but it is not a good thing. And they're not balanced when they're doing this. And it also is extremely unbalanced and uncomfortable for you as well as the horse. And this is something you would just want to bring them back to a walk or a trot and ask them to pick up the correct lead. So the last thing we're going to talk about are schooling some figures, which we're going to start doing some more and more of these in class. Circles. We've been doing lots of circles already, and we've been doing a half circle or a reverse. So I'm not really going to go through those. I feel like you should understand them, but you might review this in the book. Some new figures is a serpentine, which we just recently covered or will be covering soon in lab. Is a snake-like figure or an S-shaped figure that has nice curved parts and then straight parts across the arena. So, and this is really good for practicing your turning, your aids, and balance, which is why we're going to probably do this quite a bit more in class. Our serpentine in class, we use some cones to help identify and make sure we make all of our loops the same size. But once you are more accomplished, you can divide the arena up and do a serpentine without having markers. The next is a figure eight. One important things about a figure eight is that you should be able to have like a straight line down the middle, basically, or you should not do a circle this way and then right here go diagonally across the arena. That is not correct for a figure eight. So a figure eight, I think a lot of times it's easy to kind of think of as making like two Ds. So you have a straight line here, and then you make a circle, and then you find a straight line, and then you make a circle. I did not mean to do that. So that is one thing. We will practice a figure eight soon, but you should always start and finish your figure eight in the center. So you would come to the center, start your figure eight, a circle to the right, and then doing a circle to the left, and then you end your figure eight finding that same point in your starting point. And then a change of direction on the diagonal, or a change of rein is what it's sometimes called, is you're going along the rail and then you would cut all the way across the diagonal of the arena to change directions. So hopefully you have a better understanding of some different figures and then using your aids more effectively. Please start thinking about those while you're writing. I mean, until you get more practice, some of that's going to be difficult, but it is definitely good to think about using more than just one aid while you're writing if you want to improve upon your skills. So also, don't forget to take the quiz this week. I recommend that you look through the notes in the book, especially since we're getting to more and more complicated material as we go on throughout the semester. And I'll see you in lab.